Mind Body Life show hosted by Frederick Entenmann on Global Voice Radio on Fridays at 10 a.m. Eastern. During his show, Mind Body Life founder and best-selling author Frederick Entenmann investigates the little-known insights and daily methods used to create explosive life transformations and transitions with those that have risen from struggle and ascended to greatness. Here is your Mind Body Life host, Frederick Entenmann.
Welcome to the Mind Body Life show. I'm your host, Frederick Entenmann. I'm a former professional athlete, a best-selling author of Surviving Sports, The Game of Life, coach and consultant, and I help professional athletes win the game of life. In today's episode 17, I want to welcome you first and foremost. We're going to talk about finances. This can be a very complex topic, but I think it's fascinating to know, as well as others, I think, want to know, why do professional athletes struggle with finances? And this is a huge topic because being a professional athlete, and especially the athletes that get that $5 million contract, that get that $10 million contract or above, 9 times out of 10 let it slip through their fingers. And I guess the best analogy that I can make, since I have seen personal friends kind of be in a situation, it's like an individual that hasn't spent 30, 40 years building up their wealth with their own business. You know, and by the time you build that up and let's just say into the millions, that is your baby, and you've gone through the entire process of developing a wealth consciousness and developing your wealth skills over decades and decades, to where that money lasts a lifetime. And it usually takes someone 20, 30, 40 years to gain those skills. Well, the analogy is going to be that of an individual that goes to the corner market and suddenly wins the lotto. And if you've ever heard of lottery winners saying they wish they've never even won the lotto because of the tumultuousness that it put their life through, hopefully I can shed some light on this topic, because the conception about professional athletics is that professional athletes live this stardom life, this stardom lifestyle, and they rarely get to see what the truths behind, number one, making that kind of money, and number two, actually when you break it down, where that money goes. The typical retirement planning story that we read about in the financial news involves a baby boomer looking to make the right choices at the end of a 35-year or longer career. And the reason we read about them, because most of us can probably relate to them. But we can also learn from another kind of retirement, and that's of the 25-year-old professional athlete. It might seem, again, like a pro athlete in the NFL and a baby boomer in the workplace don't actually have much in common, but they face a surprisingly similar set of challenges as, let's just say, newly minted retirees. Unfortunately for professional athletes, those challenges and the mistakes that can come with them are magnified, and so are their costs. Interestingly enough, an analysis by Sports Illustrated found that almost 80% of NFL athletes face serious financial distress or bankruptcy within 2 years of retiring from the league. And 60% of NBA players, I actually think that number is probably higher, 60% of NBA players who enjoy longer careers than their NFL colleagues have similar problems within 5 years, just 5 years. And there's many theories about why this happens, and there's certainly unique challenges to building a life after sports. That's why I do what I do to ensure a professional athlete wins the game of life, because I've seen this way too often, where an individual spend their entire lifetime in reaching the top through having that discipline and relentlessness of becoming a professional athlete, and yet their life or financial skills just don't match up. And, these athletes often make critical mistakes when retiring as well. And they're also mistakes that your average boomer retiree is also surprisingly susceptible to. And mistake one is seeing your balance and thinking it's a ton of money. It's seeing your balance and thinking that you're set. And so whether you're a 35-year-old professional athlete who just left the league, or a 65-year-old accountant ready to set aside the spreadsheets, it's easy to jump into retirement with a little too much enthusiasm. Okay, after all, you're probably itching to get started on traveling and the hobbies and living a little after all that work and sacrifice, right? Understandably so. But it's important to take a step back. Your savings might look like a lot of money right now. And I actually remember, I didn't play in the NBA. I didn't get the opportunity to play in the league. I opted to play in Europe, and even in Europe, I got my first paycheck, and it's a little bit of disillusionment, because you think that money psychologically is going to last forever, but you really need to take a step back, and especially since retirement can last a lot longer than you actually think. An interesting stat is, according to the Centers for Disease Control, the average 65-year-old can actually expect to live almost 20 more years past 65 in retirement. So keep in mind, that's an average. Half of 65-year-olds will live longer, in actually many cases much longer. So in other words, that asset base you've worked so hard to put together might need to last you quite a while. Let's keep that in mind. So when you're building a plan for retirement, it's better to err on the side of caution. Start by putting together a sustainable budget, and make sure your investment strategy is aligned with your needs and goals. And I know as soon as the word budget is included, people really get taken aback, because the word alone is it involves a skill set that takes time to develop. And actually, what I recommend is actually just start with a budget worksheet and build the discipline over time. That's just keeping it very simple, but that's a start. So just like a retiring athlete who wants to avoid problems later, it's important to have a lifestyle that won't deplete your savings too fast. And the key, really, I can't say it enough, is when I work with my athletes, I look at their lifestyle and try to re-engineer to where it just simplicity reigns. Now, complexity is what brings about a destructive lifestyle, a stressed lifestyle, an anxious lifestyle. Simplification is the key. The second mistake is, I'd say, assuming you'll get to choose your retirement date. Many people in their 50s and 60s actually have a retirement date in mind, but sometimes life gets in the way. That's the sad truth. And whether it's layoffs or health crisis, and even just lifestyle changes can change your plans for you. We all know that. You might even know a friend or a relative that we've seen them go through these hard times, and life hits. So much like the athlete who ends up with a career-ending injury, such as myself, The possibility that you had an unexpectedly early retirement is higher than you might realize. In fact, 48% of retirees end up leaving the workforce ahead of schedule. And that comes from the Employee Benefit Research Institute. The majority aren't doing it by choice either. That's why a conservative view of your plans is so important. If you can save more, keep your expenses in check and invest wisely starting today. And you'll likely be in better shape if you lose out on a few years of additional income and savings later. One of my favorite quotes when it comes to finances is by Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest men in the world, for good reason. And all he says is, pay yourself first. No matter what, whatever comes your way, whether it's in any way, shape, or form of finances, in the form of money that comes your way, pay yourself first. Put a little to the side. That's just the ultimate discipline and financial healthy habit that I think one can implement in their lives. Mistake number 3, planning to retirement, then not having something to do in retirement. And the professional athletes have to be extremely focused on their sport. That goes without saying. And many of us are too busy living our lives that we forget to think ahead. That's another reason why I do what I do. I've seen 9.9 out of 10 the professional athletes reach retirement, or they're forced out of their sport, and they are not ready once that sports bubble bursts. So just like a large number of ex-athletes, many retirees struggle with what to do once the structure in their lives, once that lifestyle or the career that once defined you bursts and it's gone. You know, the meetings, the career, the getting the kids to school or whatever it may be falls away. And some retirees expect to live leisurely and read books, and only to find that they're extremely bored. Others experience a loss of meaning. The productivity and camaraderie that they used to get from work is no longer there. And still others find that the cost of the lifestyle that they want exceeds the reality of their means. And this is also why professional athletes go broke. They just simply overspend, and the spending gets out of control. And before you know it, there's nothing left. So to avoid these problems, it's helpful to start thinking about your post-retirement life well beforehand, and to start laying the groundwork for it, whether it means a second act as a part-time consultant or a champion of, a horse shows. Figure out how you want to spend your time and what impact your plans will have on your income, your expenses, and quality of life. These are just some tips that are going to help yourself transition with ease. And some people ease into retirement, and others, again, fall into it. And for many people, the transition comes at a great shock. So aside from being lucky in life, the best thing you can do for your retirement is plan and overplan. You need to be considering your finances as its own structure and health and wealth, its own wellness set. Because after all, there's a reflection of our lives. So planning makes it more likely you'll enjoy a stress-free retirement, because it forces you to consider what you would do if it's a difficult one. And whether you're a star quarterback or a company administrator, the right financial plan will account for your budget and your household finances and investment strategy. And unlike a life on the field or in your chosen vocation, it's also unlikely to be particularly exciting. Because great financial planning is more often than not methodical and prudent and practical. It's a long-term endeavor that requires consistent attention and patience, most of all. So in other words, the financial planning for retirement isn't the winning Hail Mary pass or buzzer beater shot at the end of the game. It's the training camps, it's the research, it's the strategies, it's the skill building first thing in the morning, and the endless number of practices that get you there. It is the ultimate discipline. And here's kind of how and why athletes go broke. Recession or no recession, whatever you want to call it, many NFL or NBA or major leaguers, the baseball players have a real penchant for losing most or all of their money. It's a disturbing fact. It's a disturbing statistic. And it's bizarre because it doesn't really matter how much they make. And the ways they blow it are really strikingly similar. It's almost like we see a lot of athletes that have made over $100 million in their career. That's enough to last generations and leave a true legacy, and kind of stuck with what the hell happened here. 7 floors above the iced over Dallas North Tollway. This Rocket Ishmael used to play for University of Notre Dame is revisiting this very question. And it's December, and Rocket Ishmael is sitting in the boardroom of actually Chapwood Investments. I'll take you through a little scenario and story here. Chapwood Investments is a wealth management firm. In his white Notre Dame snow hat pulled down, he's first let me give you a little background on Rocket Ishmael. In 1991, Rocket Ishmael hit the nationwide scene as a junior wide receiver for Notre Dame Fighting Irish, which he was the presumptive number 1 pick in the NFL draft, number 1 pick overall. Instead, he actually signed with the CFL's Toronto Argonauts for, I think it was almost $20 million over 4 years. And at that time, it was the richest contract in football history. I was in high school. I remember because Canada was, the Canadian border across Lake Erie was only a mile away from where I grew up. So made news everywhere. So it was a huge contract in 1991. It seemed like an insanely amount of money in pay. You know what? $18.2 million over 4 years still is a lot of money. But today, as I recently read, he's at a private session on financial planning, or at least he's been trying to turn his life around, as well as other pro athletes. He has now what he didn't have before, and that's hindsight. And I'll take you through a couple quotes here. I once had a meeting with J.P. Morgan. He's telling the group, and it was literally like listening to Charlie Brown's teacher, quote unquote. And the men surrounding Rocket Ishmael at the conference table includes, the Los Angeles Angels outfielder Torrey Hunter, the Cowboys wideout Isaiah Stenbach, 6 former pros from the NFL and NBA, Eric Strickland, and linebackers Winfred Tubbs and Eugene Lockhart. And Ishmael kind of cracks and makes light of, I was so busy focusing on football that the first year was suddenly over. And I can attest, I'll tell you what, my first year abroad was over before I could even blink an eye. It was crazy. Just swept me away. And Rocket says again, I started with this $4 million base salary, but then I looked at my bank statement and I just went, what the? So before Rocket Ishmael could elaborate on his kind of bewilderment over the complexity of that statement and the amount of money he had already lost, 8 heads are nodding, 8 faces smiling in agreement. And the hunter kind of chimes in. Once you get into the financial stuff, and it kind of sounds like a foreign language, guys are just like, I'm not going back. I'm not going back to the financial meetings. I'm lost. And it brings back memories of school where maybe certain concepts aren't explained properly. Maybe it's too much too soon. And that's the problem I see as a professional athlete. You really need to have your own mentor, your own coach, someone you can trust. And the details are mind-boggling. And I know a lot of these athletes hire business development coaches and so on, personal advisors and so on and so forth. But actually, what happens to many athletes and their money is really hard to believe. More examples are the Saints' all-time leader, Deuce McAllister, filed for bankruptcy protection from a car dealership he owns. A Panthers receiver from the NFL, Hussein Muhammad, put his mansion in Charlotte up for sale on eBay a month after news broke that his entertainment company was being sued by Wachovia Bank for overdue credit card payments. And penniless former NFL running back Travis Henry was jailed for non-payment of child support. In a less public way, other athletes from the nation's 3 biggest and most profitable leagues, which are the NBA, NFL, and MLB, Major League Baseball, they're all suffering from a financial pandemic. And it's interesting because although salaries have risen steadily through the last decades, reports from a host of sources, and those sources are athletes or players associations, agents, financial advisors, they all mostly came up with statistics that indicate that by the time they've retired for just 2 years, 80% of former NFL players have gone bankrupt and are under financial stress because of joblessness or divorce. And within 5 years of retirement, an estimated 70% of former NBA players are broke. Now, numerous retired Major League Baseball players have been similarly ruined, and the current economic crisis is really taking a toll on the active players as well. In fact, the big and famous Johnny Damon of the Yankees, or even Boston Red Sox, as well as Jacoby Ellsbury and pitchers Mike Pelfrey of the Mets and Scott Iyer of the Phillies. Now, these are just a few. They discovered that at least some of their money is tied up in $8 billion fraud allegedly perpetrated by Texas financier Robert Allen Stanford. And Pelfrey actually told the New York Post that 99% of his fortune was frozen. And Aaron admitted last month that he's broke, and the team acknowledged and then agreed to advance a portion of at least of his $2 million salary. Mind-boggling, right? It's absolutely mind-boggling, which is why each and every athlete actually needs a trusted mentor, a trusted coach, rather than kind of rolling the craps and saying, hey, I'm, just because the league is tied up with this financial advising firm, they've got my back. Well, I'm here to tell you as a former player and athlete, that's not true at all. And that's part of the problem. In fact, it's a major part of the problem. The Wall Street meltdown is only the latest threat to athletes' financial health. Athletes have a different set of challenges from, let's just say entertainers. Um, and there's a far shorter peak earnings period in sports also than in any other profession. And in many cases, they lack the time and desire to understand and monitor their investments. This is a huge part of the problem. Um, and I think from that standpoint, a weekly meeting over finances needs to take place. And I do know that a lot of sports, a lot of these leagues have actually started these financial seminars or boot camps or elementary sessions that go from defining a bond to explaining a diversified portfolio as the equivalent of a balanced financial meal. And I also know that there's no charge for the sessions or even pressure to sign up, but evidently nobody's showing up. I think the statistics actually lower than 10% of all the athletes with these financial advisors and firms which the league is associated with and hold these financial seminars or whatnot. Nobody's showing up. And so the bar, when the bar for radically improving the financial habits of professional athletes is actually low enough for a toddler to trip over. And it's unbelievable because a professional athlete's money is actually supposed to outlive his career. It's crazy because most players never get that. And most people want to know why. Where do they go wrong? I've come up with kind of 3 or 4 things here. Number one being the lure of the tangible. Over the years, going back to Rocket Ishmael, because he's open about what happened to him in his life, and he's now speaking about what happened. He's kind of on the same mission as myself, is to help professional athletes not make the same mistakes. And in Rocket Ishmael's case, he's actually known as just going through a streak of bad luck and making decisions with risky investments. And after mentioning that he once poured money into a movie and then, he earns $20 million in salary, and he actually tried to come back in the NFL in 2006, but never really got beyond the workouts with the Redskins. And then he was like navigating the reality TV circuit, Pros versus Joes, and some kind of celebrity bull riding challenge. But then he tried investing in this movie that went flat up. As cautionary tales go, Ishmael's really could not have been worse. He has his Notre Dame degree. He never really filed for bankruptcy, but he had major legal problems, and he lost several $1 million. And he admits, quote unquote, it was through total ignorance. And it kind of began in the winter of 1991 when he sank $500,000 into the Rock and Roll Cafe. This was a themed restaurant in New England, and it was kind of designed to ride the wave of like the Hard Rock Cafe, Planet Hollywood franchises back then. They were big in the 90s. So he tried to get into franchising. You just kind of got to do your research. And one of his so-called quote-unquote trusted advisors kind of pitched the idea as a fail-proof with no downsides. Sure. And Ishmael recalls, he never recouped his money and had no idea what even became of the restaurant. So, lesson learned? I mean, if only Ishmael's trusted advisor squandered a fortune funding not only that movie, but also music labels, and other investments that basically broke him. And actually, one that had opened in New Orleans, but we know the history of New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina, I guess, came a couple months later, and well, the shops don't even exist anymore. So you could say that Ishmael is an example of extremity, of kind of an extreme luck. He had a run of terrible luck, but the odds were never close to really being in his favor either. So it's just an example of taking a step back. Industry experts estimate that only 1 in 30 of the highest caliber private investment deals works out as advertised. So chronic over allocation into real estate and bad private equities, actually the number one problem for athletes in terms of financial meltdowns. It's way up there to where professional athletes make poor decisions or they trust someone to make those decisions. And yet with the athletes who are often uninterested or either conservative spending or the stock market, those percentages in terms of securities are pretty invisible in terms of private equity and real estate, a mix of public securities like stocks and mutual funds and the like. If you don't study them, they're unintelligible. Not to mention, I find highly boring. It's inventions or nightclubs, car dealerships, and t-shirt companies have an advantage. It's the thrill of tangibility, right? It's more exciting. You get to actually see your investment. But, many players consequently are just financial prey. Disreputable people see athletes' money as very easy to get to. And this is a quote by Stephen Baker. He's actually a sports agent, and he represents about 30 NFL players. And going back in time to a decade ago, former quarterbacks Drew Bledsoe and Rick Meyer and 5 other NFL retirees invested at least $100,000 apiece in a now defunct startup called Pay-by-Touch, which actually touted biometric authentication technology that was going to help replace credit cards with fingerprints. Even as the company was wrecked by lawsuits and internal dissent, the players, I think, come to find out, the players later sued the financial services firm UBS, which had encouraged its clients to invest in Pay-by-Touch, for allegedly withholding information about the company's founders' criminal history and drug use. So again, just don't jump the gun because it's recommended and someone's all excited about an idea. You have to do your research and do your due diligence. We can go on and on about personal examples, and there's a few, but you really have to consider, I'd say this is number 2 out of the examples, is misplaced trust. Salary side, okay, the closest analog, again, when I first came into this episode 17, I'd say the closest analog to pro athlete, it's not actually a white collar executive, okay? It's a lottery winner who's often in his early 20s. With athletes, there's an extraordinary metamorphosis of financial challenge. And, coming off college scholarships, most professional athletes haven't even learned the basics of budgeting or even keeping receipts, which then essentially triggers 2 fatal mistakes. It's hiring the wrong people as advisors and trusting them far too much. And I actually have a quote by Magic Johnson. He said, "That's the killer." Magic Johnson started out by admitting he knew nothing about business and seeking counsel from the power brokers who sat courtside of the old LA Forum men, such as Hollywood agent Michael Ovidsan, Sony Pictures CEO Peter Guber. Now Johnson says he gets calls from star players every single day, like Alex Rodriguez, Shaquille O'Neal, Dwayne Wade, and actually cuts them short if they propose lying on friends and family. It won't even be a conversation, says Magic Johnson. They hire these people not because of expertise, but because they're friends. Well, they'll fail. And, you know, it even goes to another player recommending someone else. You know, I got this guy, cousin, who's an accountant, but usually gets an accountant in the hood, and you hire him, you're doing him a favor. And before you know it, your bank account's empty. Rod Strickland, who was a great NBA player, realized it all too late in 2001 when a friend of a close friend of a 9-year NBA vet proposed a real estate deal in Georgia. And Strickland turned to his business manager, actually his dad, who's a retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, the paper on the plot of land, which was on sale for approximately $1.8 million, but supposedly had been appraised for as much as $3 million, it appeared legitimate. So Strickland bought it. In his quote is, "I trusted my father to kind of look it over for me because I was hooping and I didn't have time. And he checked it out, but he didn't go through that extra length. But I trusted. He was my dad." Well, that land wasn't worth anything close to what Strickland was told, and he had to take the hit. So lesson learned, kind of don't mix your business with family either. I wish my dad hadn't been put in that position. He just didn't have the knowledge. And as far as for his close friend, Strickland actually said the man secretly got to cut off the deal, and the conflict caused a permanent falling out between them. So relatives are not the only ones foolishly trusted with athletes' money. You know, one up-and-coming guard in the NBA allows his entire fortune to be managed by his former AAU coach, who has the player's power of attorney. And the guard's dad admitted that he had no idea who the son's accountant is, and said he wanted a financial quote-unquote intervention. So in NBA, let me tell you, because I was one, basketball players are a unique bunch. Of the NBA players' ignorance of his own affairs is not unique. And you hear it all the time, that someone will say to a player, "How you doing?" And a lot of the time they'll respond, "I have no idea. All the bills are paid by someone else," and essentially none of the statements even make it back to the athlete. And in fact, according to the NFL Players Association, at least 78 players lost a total of more than $42 million between 1999 and in 2002 because they trusted money to financial advisors with questionable backgrounds. And, you know, there's actually a particular dubious advisor, including Luigi Di a former felon. Go figure, sounds like a mob boss or something. I mean, that automatically, that name alone, I would investigate. Because he claimed he was an Italian accountant, but he defrauded players. I mean, major players, such as Hall of Famers, like running back Eric Dickerson, disgraced agent William Black, who built a pyramid scheme that took a total of about $15 million from at least a dozen players, including Patriots running back Fred Taylor. I mean, there's just crazy things taking place. And it's just kind of taking that extra step, from my personal opinion, and covering your back. You simply just can't turn a blind eye and trust anyone who claims to be a trusted advisor. That's just silly. And it's, on a smaller scale, it even happens on a smaller scale. It's happening everywhere. I guess this moves me into family matters. I'm going to go with family matters. And it took a little bit of digging to kind of get some statistics. But in 1996, when Panthers owner Jerry Richardson, who was a former NFL flanker turned businessman, addressed his players, one of them asked, "What's the most dangerous thing that could have happened to us financially?" And without blinking an eye, Mr. Richardson said, "Divorce." And I think players today would not disagree. In a survey reported by financial services firm Rothstein Cass, more than 80% of the 170 athletes polled, each with a minimum net worth of $5 million, and 2/3 under the age of 30, said they were concerned about being involved in the unjust lawsuits and or divorce proceedings. So by common estimates among athletes and agents, the divorce rate for pro athletes ranges from 70 to 80%, which is staggering. And in divorce proceedings, husbands routinely lose half of their net worth. But for athletes, there's really an aggravating factor when the divorce happens. Most splits occur in retirement, when the player's peak earnings period is long over and making a comparable living is virtually impossible. So such timing is no accident. There's a huge lifestyle change, says former NBA center Mark West, who's a licensed stockbroker, and he's involved with the Phoenix Suns and the player programs. He says, you and your wife are suddenly always at home, bugging each other. Before, you'd always say, "I got to go to practice." Now you don't have to go to practice. You have to finish conversations, right? And it's, this often involves an incendiary subject, which is infidelity. And, a friend of mine is actually a football player, and I just kind of asked him why he cheats on his wife. And he just kind of said, "I love her dearly, but I feel like I got married too early, and I didn't get to do what I wanted to do when I was young. I just kind of jumped into things." And not to I don't have a statistic on how common this is, but it does take place, not just in athletics, it's everywhere. But it comes down to decisions. If you're going to go get married, you better think it thoroughly through, because the repercussions can be devastating. So given all the kind of the pressures on a pro athlete's marriage, one safety valve might be the prenuptial agreement, something really very strongly recommended by the famous agent David Falk, who surged to prominence. He represented Michael Jordan, who actually didn't have one. And he says the percentage of prenups amongst athletes is appreciably lower compared with non-athletes at the same economic level. And, there's actually celebrity divorce lawyers, and one is Raul Felder, who's represented the ex-wives of Patrick Ewing and Jason Kidd and Mike Tyson, who also concurs a prenup would be very strongly recommended. In 1994, when NBA center Dikembe Mutombo was engaged to Michelle Roberts, a med student, Roberts actually refused to sign a premarital contract the day before the wedding, and 500 guests, including a large party from Mutombo's native Democratic Republic of Congo, had begun flying into Washington. Now, Roberts never signed, Folk says, and Mutombo never married the girl, so calling off the nuptials reportedly cost him $250,000, just like that. And so it's no coincidence that the woman a pro athlete often chooses to marry, and often at a young age, is actually his hometown sweetheart as well. And for that reason, the athlete can't envision a ruinous divorce. That was how you could tell if she really liked you, if she knew you before you made it, says West. But when a player doesn't make it, the question for the athlete becomes, when you get off the farm and see Paris, so to speak, can you really go back to the farm? You know, children almost always complicate the issue as well. Not to say children as a whole are complicating, it's throwing children into the mix, okay? And how to limit paternity obligations is also a challenge for professional athletes. Actually, one of my favorite players of all time, who I'll use him as an example because he's one of the most extreme examples, former NBA forward Shawn Kemp, who has at least 7 children by 6 women, and more recently Travis Henry, who has 9 by 9 women, have seen their fortunes just sapped by monthly child support payments. It's in the tens of thousands of dollars. And last month, Travis Henry, who reportedly earned almost $11 million over 7 years in the NFL, tried and failed to temporarily reduce one of his 9 child support payments by arguing that he could no longer afford the $3,000 every month. And 2 weeks later, he was actually jailed for falling $16,600 behind in payments for his child in Frostproof, Florida. The stories go on and on. It's crazy. The more I kind of undug examples, and I could talk about this for days. It's quite scary. And I think the last topic really out of all this is the great expectations. You know, the thorniest question for a professional athlete isn't how he handles himself and in those closest to him. It's kind of how you handle the new people suddenly emerging in your life. You know, they'll be expecting help or money or jobs, and they come out of the woodwork. And a lot of times, players don't even know how to say no. It's a boundary thing. It's all part of that ossified notion of how a pro athlete should live and provide for those around him. And if he isn't, you know, consuming conspicuously, then he hasn't made it. And a lot of guys try to actually spend all their money, you know, in the clubhouse or taking care of their groups of friends or peeps and so forth. And then they're buying all this jewelry and, you know, cars and clothes. And unfortunately, 10 years later, they'll ask themselves, why did I buy all this stuff? And I just think that's the ultimate crime. As soon as an athlete goes pro, people in search of handouts tend to stretch the definitions of family and friends, really. You know, when a lot of athletes go back to their hometown, whether it's cousins or friends or whoever, you hear it all the time. They're throwing letters or they're yelling or, my sister's brother went to school with you. But you really, I think that's all part of educating and preparation. If you're planning to go pro, you really need to sit down and think about your boundaries. Perhaps the upper limit on spending was set by the ever so famous Shaquille O'Neal, who, according to a document obtained by the Palm Beach Post during O'Neal's canceled divorce filing in January of 2008, spends a total of $875,000 each month, including $26,000 for childcare, $24,000 for gas, and $17,000 for clothing. But, O'Neal had really been known, and he's still known, to fund charities anonymously and cover medical bills for complete strangers, and has the wherewithal to remain solvent. But imitators have been less fortunate. When former NBA guard Kenny Anderson filed for bankruptcy in October of 2005, he detailed how the estimated $60 million he earned in the league had dwindled to nothing. For example, he bought 8 cars and rang up monthly expenses of $45,000, including outlays for child support, his mother's mortgage, his own 5-bedroom house in Beverly Hills, and not to mention $10,000 of which he listed as hanging out money. And he regularly hand out $5,000 to friends and relatives. It's unbelievable. 4 years ago, future NBA Hall of Famer Scottie Pippen unsuccessfully sued his former law firm for allegedly losing $27 million of his money through poor investments. And he'd earned about $110 million in salary alone over a 17-year career. So in February of 2007, around the time as Pippen's failed NBA comeback attempt, the Missouri Court of Appeals upheld a ruling that the player owed U.S. Bank more than $5 million in principal, interest, and attorney fees from a dispute regarding a corporate jet that he purchased in 2001. So old habits die hard. Despite all these dreadful experiences and lessons absorbed, it goes without saying, somewhere money troubles are nothing new, really, for professional athletes. So I think for new athletes, somewhere at some point in time, you have to invest in yourself, and you have to find yourself really that coach or mentor or consultant that's going to be there with you through your entire career. And you build that trust, you build that rapport. So you're gaining the skills throughout your career, and then you can transition right into real life with a plan, with money set aside for generations, and leave your legacy as you would like it. And, the cases, like I said, as I started examining the financial age-old stories of professional athletes losing it all, it's unbelievable. From Brooks Robinson, in his 23 major league seasons, of him losing everything, from Johnny Unitas in 18 NFL seasons, one of the greatest quarterbacks for the Colts, lost it all, and Rowley Fingers, the famous pitcher, from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, 20 NBA seasons, to Tony Gwynn, 20 seasons in the majors. It's It's baffling. It's absolutely baffling. And, again, I think I'll end this with the closest analog to professional athlete. It's not a white collar executive like most people think. These are young men that these high $1 million contracts fall into their laps. Okay. So it's a lottery winner. It's the analogy of the lottery winner, often in his early 20s, that goes and wins millions. And I'd say all in all, after studying these numbers and hearing athletes' stories and reading, let me tell you, to do this episode, I did a ton of research. The most dangerous thing that can happen to an athlete financially, it comes down to divorce. And if athlete isn't consuming conspicuously, then he hasn't made it. Okay, you're trying to get in good with the veterans. You feel like you have to splurge. I'd say you need to gain financial skills, no matter what it takes, and you need to develop that financial discipline and wealth consciousness in order to protect your money. So quit investing in long shots and protect your money. That's going to conclude episode 17. I know I dabbled into a little bit of everything. This is an extremely complex topic when it comes down to it, but I hope you can see the correlations. If you want to get in touch with me, I am Frederick Entenmann. I'm on LinkedIn if you want to professionally link up. If you know a professional athlete or an athlete, please recommend this episode and share this with them. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. You can feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'd love to work with you. And again, be your trusted mentor or counselor or advisor, because there's a lot of scum out there, and I'm not one of them. I want the best for you, and I want to help you win the game of life. Until next time, thank you so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for joining us. Listen every Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern to Frederick Entenmann host Mind, Body, Life. Connect with Frederick at www.globalvoiceradio.com. Tune in next week for another edition of Mind, Body, Life on Global Voice Radio